Hello and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, and I'm here to speak with everyday superheroes helping nonprofits. Joining me today is Candice Elliott, to talk about employee needs and mental well-being. Candice, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Alex.
So I would love to start off by knowing your superhero origin story. That is to say, how did you get started working with nonprofits?
Yeah, it's been a long, long, long time. I was roped into serving on the board of a local nonprofit here in Santa Cruz County, California, about 12 years ago. It's a soup kitchen and food pantry. And that was just such an amazing experience. Prior to that, I'd volunteered at different nonprofit organizations, especially those helping, women and children in the education kind of sphere and in mental health and well-being also.
Cool. And what made you over time start focusing more of your efforts on mental well-being?
I had my own mental breakdown. I went to school for human resources and got my master's degree at the same time as being the human resources director for a restaurant group. And the level of stress in that role was extreme. I hired 100 people myself every year and then also managed the managers who were, you know, overseeing all of those folks. And we had a particularly difficult situation come up, and I had, I think, what people would call a panic attack, like where you can't breathe and your heart's racing and it's like
Yep.
you feel like you're being attacked, but there's like really nothing actually physically happening around you. So I had this experience. I knew that there was something that was disconnected within me. I tried to seek out mental health support at that time. And what I was referred to was a psychiatrist who basically told me, you're fine, and this happens to people, and go back to work. And over the years, I've been able to sort of understand how to balance being really effective in the workplace with also being able to have the time to rest and recuperate.
Yeah, I've experienced once a panic attack, and it is not pleasant.
No.
But I think it's such an important issue, mental health, that I think unfortunately we don't talk about enough in general in society because I mean, especially for me, I thought I experienced anxiety for the first time last year, late last year. And before then, I thought I knew what anxiety was, and I had no idea until I actually experienced it. And like, oh wow, this is very different than what I thought it was. I mean, I was also referred to a psychologist or psychiatrist to help, and it does help. And there's many different ways of coping, and we'll talk about a few today, I'm sure. But the idea is that we need to take care of people. Like we are human. I think we're stretching ourselves to a certain extent too far in many different ways, and things are coming at us so quickly, and we feel a pressure and a sense of I'm not sure what, but we'll get into that part too, I'm sure. But the idea is that I would love it if we would have more conversations like this. And I'm glad we're having today's conversation, I guess is what I'll finish that sentence.
Yeah, I think some background there too, some statistics that are interesting is the Bureau of Labor Statistics has done studies on how productive we are as individual workers. And people are 500% more productive today than we were in the 1950s. And a lot of that is because of technological advances. But we haven't decided that those technological advances result in working less. We're working the same or more. So that's an interesting sort of societal decision that we've made that isn't really a decision, it's a default. And then the other thing is the US Chamber of Commerce and Hiring Our Heroes, which is a veterans organization that supports that's getting hired after service. They did a study on mental health in the workplace and found that 80% of Americans will have a mental health crisis during their work life. And so it is something that we don't talk about very often, but it is something that most of us experience, if not all of us experience at one point or another.
500% more efficient than the 50s. That makes sense to me. And I
Yeah.
think the initial selling point of technology was it'll make your life easier. It'll have so much more free time. but it's reversed. The more you can do, the more you do. It
Yeah.
reminds me of this quote of, what is it? Finishing your work will be rewarded with more work. Like
Yeah.
it doesn't stop. We'll just fill it up with more and more and more. And at some point, we're not built for that, right? And we crack sometimes. Okay. So let's talk about maybe a high level and general health, and not just the negatives, but the positives too. And especially from the perspective of a nonprofit. So let's imagine a small nonprofit or a medium, well, it doesn't really matter the size, I suppose, but let's imagine a nonprofit and they want to make sure that their employees or staff, even their volunteers, are feeling fulfilled, that they don't, preventative measures are always better than measures after. So what are some things that a nonprofit can do or implement or at least consider to make sure that they have the best possible chance or their employees have the best possible chance for feeling fulfilled?
Yeah. Well, most of my clients are nonprofit organizations and they work in a variety of different environments. From people who are supporting people experiencing homelessness and setting up emergency shelters to people who are rebuilding our county parks to restoring our local watersheds. It's kind of runs the gambit. And so what has been helpful for them, one of the things is to understand everyone's workload and just what are the tasks that each person has in the organization. It takes a minute to sort of list out everything that you do. I had to do this before my last maternity leave to be able to delegate to my team these things, but to list out all of the things that the organization does, each person and what they do, whether that is actually contributing to the values and the goals of the organization, and then the degree of complexity of the thing, the degree of enjoyment of the thing for an individual can also be really important. And so when we're thinking about sustainability and, people feeling supported in the workplace, the workload has a huge it's a huge factor in that for people. The ways that people are scheduled, if the work needs to be in person, having enough backup, if, people need to switch out of shifts. I think a lot of organizations sort of run on exactly what you need in the employee pool in order to function. And it's helpful to be able to create some redundancies and some cross training so that when the inevitable situation happens where there is a tricky moment, you have the backup plan in place. I think backup plans are so important to develop because you don't need them until you need them. And then when you need them, you really need them. And then there has to do with, how you're setting up compensation and benefits for staff. So you want to have compensation that is at least competitive in your local market so that employees who are looking for the same or similar jobs in other organizations will not leave just because of the money piece. And that's not always possible to do. That's not always affordable for an organization to do. But one of the things that I help with is just a simple sort of compensation audit to check how does compensation in your organization compare to your local market. I have this tool, it's called the Economic Research Institute Salary Assessor that I use. And so it can really drill down into a location, the size of organization, the job type, and all of these things. And then with benefits, thinking about, if you're offering medical insurance or, if you're not able to offer medical insurance, then perhaps considering some kind of a stipend for your people. And just thinking about, what is the infrastructure that the organization can put in place that will help to be a buffer between the employees and the volunteers even, and then the external market and the changing dynamics of the market. And, not even just market forces, but also you can think about, climate forces and different kinds of things that impact an employee on a personal level and how the organization can be a protective container for the employee and what you're uniquely positioned to do.
These are great tips. There's quite a few of them though. And I know, which is great. I mean, the more the better, actually, I guess.
I could go on.
Yeah. Let's take a pause there. It's good. So it sounds like the first part is kind of doing an assessment, like you said, but it's assessment to understand the people. Like that obviously could take time and effort, but like I would love if you could underline the importance of doing that because I do see value, but I really want to make sure it's clear because if you don't know what people are doing, you don't know how much time they spend doing it, whether they really enjoy doing it or not. Like you said, the complexity of it. So this, I see like a chart of some kind where people have all their scores and you can see people who are maybe some are underutilized and some are overutilized. And that will start giving you an idea of saying, well, wait a minute, maybe we can shift things around to make person A's life be easier and start benefiting more from person B. Like, is there more to it than that? I'm sure there is, but I would
Yeah.
have to your inputs on that.
Yeah. So one of my clients, they do an annual employee survey and they have a lot of questions that they ask, but one of them is about workload. And when we were looking at the survey results, we saw that workload was one of the things that was lowest on the list. Like people were feeling just completely beyond their capacity with the workload. And so over the course of the year, we identified what the tasks are that they do. We identified how that related to the organizational goals. We identified the complexity and, how much the person enjoyed it or not. So in this employee pool, we were finding that everybody was maxed out, right? So how do we look at all the work that is being done and how do we eliminate what isn't necessary, what is too complex? How do we automate things that can be automated in this, world of work? And then also over the course of that year and making incremental changes, we looked at the job descriptions of every person in the organization too, and made sure that they matched what was on this, workload list. And so we were able to bring that number up. And to the point now where people feel like they have a decent amount of work, like they're not, like they go through periods of stress, but it is not overwhelmingly stressful all the time. In other organizations, you can have some people who are stressed all the time and other people that feel more freedom and don't have as intense of a workload. And so what you can do with that is to allocate, from the more intense group, some of the tasks over to the folks that are feeling less stressed. Something else that you can identify in a situation like that, if it isn't appropriate to move tasks, is if you perhaps have the wrong positions. You might have people who are in assistant positions and really you need coordinator positions or you need manager positions or you need director positions. So it can help to not just reorganize the work among the existing team, but also identify as you're developing the organization, what are the roles that you need in the future or what are the roles that you should eliminate.
I really like the idea of starting with a yearly survey. I think that's a great way, rather than jumping into a huge assessment of pulling everybody aside and saying, okay, let's build that matrix that I mentioned. Starting with a simple satisfaction survey, which of course you can include other things as well in that survey as well.
If anybody wants one, contact me. I'll send it to you.
Awesome. So starting with that yearly survey rather, is a great way to start because this way you get in a feel for what they're going through and then you can decide whether you need to make adjustments or not and whether you need to go deeper diving into some of this this workload balance and stuff. So that's great advice to start with. I also want to draw your attention to the backups because I find that too is underutilized, undermentioned, underdone. I'm not sure of the right word, but you're right. Backups are not needed until they're needed and then they're really needed. That was a beautiful way of saying it. And it happens with everything in life. I have backups even for this microphone we're talking on now, for example, backups with my laptop and everything. So my life is all about redundancy because you never know when something will happen. And my last week or 2 weeks ago, my hard drive blew up and I had to actually stop the recording of this podcast with someone because it blew up. But I had a backup Chromebook to keep me going until I was able to find a replacement. So even at that basic level, at a tech level, backups are important. So for talking about people, this is something that can be a bit tricky because usually there's only one person that's good at or very good at doing something and they're the allocated primary person. So how would you manage backups or redundancies when it comes to people?
Yeah, I'm also one who has my backup, headphones here. So when it comes to people, what helps is to have teams that are working on things together, if that is possible for you to do. I think, when we're sort of thinking about the amount of time that people are working, we can try to be very efficient with everyone's time and to keep people working on different tasks from each other, or, isolate certain tasks to, the development assistant, for example, and then have the development director working on completely different things. But if there are periods of time or activities where you can bring the assistant in to start to understand what's happening behind the scenes of what the development director is doing in this example, then they can start to build the skill set to be able to, do a few things. One is to be able to fill in if the development director has some kind of emergency and can't work, on the key elements that need to be happening to move the work forward. The other thing that is great about that is you open up the possibility for mentorship, and for having conversations that aren't just task-based, but are also about the profession that the person is working in and how to develop in the profession and what's sort of strategically important or philosophically important in the work that you don't always get on the front lines of the work, but that are things that actually help to retain people and keep them over time. And then also to help this person, to be able to move into that role in the future, and not just, in your organization, which is important to have a pipeline, but also if we think just generally about our society, that, it's incumbent in our work to be training up the next generation that will be moving into these leadership roles. And so the more that we can do at this time to educate, to share knowledge, to listen, to try to, rework things that are not working, bringing in new perspectives, the better we're going to be prepared for the future that's coming at us.
I really like the idea of mentorship. I think it's a great way to start. And to help with that, technology can play a big role, because if someone is scribbling notes on a piece of paper in their handbook, it gets very difficult for someone to be able to jump in and take over if that person is unavailable for some time. So
Yes.
having technologies in place like a CRM, for example, or any other central place where you're storing information, notes, files that anyone with the right permissions can get access to, is one way to help support the mentorship and the doubling or the backup perspective.
Oh yeah, CRMs, SOPs, project management systems, a file sharing system that makes sense that people can use and they'll be able to find things if they go into it. Yes.
SOPs is a great one. So standard operating procedures. I mean, the idea here, just in case some people don't know, is making sure that you have at least some documentation of what you do and how you do it. And I know it's tedious and no one really likes doing documentation. But, for certain key parts, I think this is really critical because, again, this is part of the backup process and you don't need it until you need it.
Yeah, like payroll, right? What if the person who does payroll can't do payroll? What do you do? That's a really key one, to have at least a basic understanding of the process in place so that someone can pick it up if it needs to be taken.
So speaking of payroll, we talked about, or you mentioned compensation and benefits as well. And so doing some kind of analysis in the local market, you mentioned a tool you have as well. Are there other, like, compensation isn't always about financial compensation, right? It's a total package. So have you noticed any kind of other incentives or types of compensation that is not financial that really helps well-being?
Yeah, other than, managing workload, and one of the things that, I'm also thinking just about like utilization rates. So utilization rate is like how much of your time is billable to a grant. And it's very difficult to have 100% of your time billable to anything. So having sort of a realistic understanding of how much time a person will be billing to grants versus how much time is going to be overhead, and figuring out how to get that into your contracts with your clients or with your, the people that you're serving, if that's your model, that can help a lot. It depends on the work that you do specifically. Your organization is uniquely positioned to do certain kinds of things. One of the organizations I'm working with right now is a museum of art and history. And so as an organization, they have museum organizational memberships, and those memberships come with benefits that they can then pass on to their team. So, they have artists who come and talk. They have different kinds of art exhibitions that happen. And so what they're able to do for their employees as sort of a cultural center and as a piece of social infrastructure is different from another organization, for example, who is building parks and is, showing movies to kids at night in parks. And so I think it is understanding your work and understanding. The Surgeon General came out with a study in 2021 that we don't talk about as much as the one that talks about how lonely everyone is. But this other study that came out just a little bit later, it talks about health and well-being and how the workplace can be a part of that. And one of those key pieces is social infrastructure. And this is our relationships with the people that we work with, our relationships with people in our community, our relationships with people in other organizations. And to be able to have a strong social infrastructure is one of the things that contributes to people's well-being. And it's one of the places that nonprofits are uniquely positioned to be able to give their employees.
The other type of compensation that I was thinking of was training and being able to offer training to your employees. So maybe you can't pay them more, but you can pay for their training. And that is a great way to show appreciation for what they do.
So much. And identifying where they want to grow.
Yes.
And matching training with their growth. Yeah.
Exactly. Cool. That actually led me to you raised a good point, because now there's, especially for other organizations in the for-profit world, there's this whole push for returning to the office instead of working from home. And there are benefits to both. But I mean, we are social creatures as humans. So sometimes people say that the hybrid approach is best when people can choose when they want to come into the office, but at least be there for, let's say, 2-3 times a week. I was wondering if you have any insight on whether staying at home full time is good for your mental health, or being at the office full time, or maybe a combination of the two. Like, what is your input in terms of the balance there?
Yeah, I think people are so unique. I'm very introverted actually. And so being able to work at home for me was really nice. I didn't have kids actually in the middle of the pandemic yet. So it just got to be, me and my husband at home. And that was great for us. I think that other people really want to be around other people, and they, get a lot of energy from being around others and sharing ideas. And so I think that when you're building a workplace that works for people, especially that works for the younger generations that are currently entering the workforce, that, considering the type of work is important, right? There's some work that just is in person because you're meeting a group at the river and you're taking them on a tour and you're doing restoration work together. That's, one type of work that happens. But I think that a lot of work that needs to happen on computers, for example, even a lot of, meetings, I think some meetings could actually be phone calls. I think that if you're going to create a work environment where people are working in the office or on location on certain days and not in the office or not on location other days, you want to have it be consistent, if you can, for the whole workforce, or at least for teams, so that they're the same and they're treated the same. That's a thing in human resources, is you want to treat employees like other employees as much as possible. And any differences that you want to have them in classes of employees. But yeah, so I think, additionally, some groups need time physically together in order to work through things. I work with an architectural firm, and they just need everybody in the same room looking at drawings at the same time and marking them up, and so that someone can go fix them. It doesn't work to do it asynchronously, and it's just not as effective if everybody's not in the room. So identifying what those times are, those key times where you really want to bring everyone together, where it's going to be more efficient, where, also where it's going to build the team more and help everybody to feel, aligned and like they're, working together, is really important. One of my other clients is a fully remote workforce where, nobody works in the same place or at the same time, really. But 2 times a year, they bring everyone together for a week, and they have, just very specific sort of things that they work through during those offsites together.
In that case, is it more, when you say work through things together, is that more on the social side or the business side? Like they are doing
It's
actual
both.
work? Both? Okay.
They do both. They do, a welcome dinner the first night that's, reconnecting and, more of a personal connection. And then there's an overview of what's going to happen during the week. They have, quarterly goals that they're working towards. So each employee or a few of the employees do a session a day. And so they have problem solving work. They have aligning on goals and the strategy moving forward that happens. And they have some educational components that happen where they're training a part of the team on work that's happening in another part of the team. So yeah, that's how they're designed.
That's cool. And I like the idea
Yeah.
of treating employees the same. I find there's always a balance in it. I don't know if there's a formula that can solve the problem. But like some people, to your point, are more effective when they're with other people. And sometimes you need to sit down with a group and have like a working session together. It's not effective at all to do it remotely. And some people, can really deep dive and get full concentration and deeper concentration where they're at home. So there's always a balance between those two. And especially if some people are in the office, but they need people who are not in the office, that becomes a bit tricky as well. So I just want to know if you had any thoughts on that, or is it just every organization has to figure out that equation for themselves?
Yeah, I think it so much depends on the type of work that needs to happen. Um, One thing that's coming to mind is, if there is disagreement that's going on, it is often, it's more helpful to bring people together in person to work through disagreements. And if there are a lot of disagreements that are happening in the workforce, like between departments or between employees, it might be a time to bring everybody together for a short amount of time to sort of realign the work and the priorities and hash out some of those things. I think it can be really important for people to express that they have differences of opinion when they're in the same room, and to be able to talk through those differences and then to be able to arrive, at a solution. So I don't think that there is a prescriptive, this is the one thing that will work with every single organization. But I think, some overall things are, that thing about disagreements, bring people together and hash it out. Don't necessarily feel like you have to control what the outcome is going to be. Often people will arrive at the solution that you want them to get to if you just let them go at it for a little bit. Obviously, people need to be respectful of one another and be able to, function in that way. And then sort of assessing what works best for your team, and try, if it is possible, to incorporate some kind of remote work, then to do that. Because especially as the younger generation is coming into the workforce, it just doesn't make sense that certain things need to happen in the office and that a person needs to be there from, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. It just doesn't compute in the same way. And I think too, another thing, it's not just younger generations. It's also that, those of us who are in the middle part of our lives are caring for children. We're also caring for elders, where, there's a lot of sort of care work that is not paid work, but that needs to happen. And that falls on those, people with those responsibilities too. And so remote work can help people to be able to balance their responsibilities of caring for others with their responsibilities of work.
That's a good call out for the conflict resolution in person. I totally agree that it's usually easier to solve in person than. Okay. There was one thing I noticed on your website as I was doing a bit of research for today was you have something called a regenerative practice or regenerative practices. Can you explain a bit more what that is and how they work?
Yeah. So regenerative practices are sort of like a category of things. The terminology comes mostly from farming and sustainable farming practices. But the idea in farming is that you are putting into the soil the nutrients that the plants need in order to grow. And you're not, you know, in biodynamic farming, for example, you're not spraying with pesticides. You're not, you're not eliminating all of the other plant life that's growing. You're kind of letting the environment be what it is. And you're helping to grow, for example, trees by putting the right nutrients and resources into the soil. And so the same, I think, is true for people. By doing that in a farm, it becomes sustainable over the long term to be able to grow things. Things grow better. They tend to not have as many diseases. They tend to have more juicy, delicious fruit that's coming out, for example. And so with people, I think, we have to think about the long term of a person who's working, right? We're not, people, the workforce is aging. People are working longer than they have in the past. And so we have to think about how can we create environments where people are going to continue to be able to do the work, for a long time. And so how do we create the conditions that will be supportive of people, through the early years of the work, through their, middle years, and as they're becoming, more advanced or specialized in their work. And then later on, as they're maybe wanting to take a step back, but still be involved. And so it's just considering sort of the life cycle of a person, their work, the type of organization that you have, and then the way that you can be supportive of people and help them to continue going. Because if we don't think about that, people inevitably burn out. We've both experienced that. After I burned out, I stopped working for a year. And I didn't fully stop, but it took a major toll on my relationship to my work. And ultimately it was helpful because it made me reorganize sort of how work was happening in my life and the ways that I was serving people who need human resources help. But it would be better if we don't put people through that.
Preventative. You always wanted to be preventative if you can.
Yeah.
So I get the mindset. Are there any specific, or can you share specific practices, things that the organizations can do to do that kind of nurturing and fostering?
Yeah. So creating career pathways within your organization is a big one. So connecting people who are early, the positions where people are early in their career to ones that are more, advanced. And it may, if you think about your community, right, it's not, very common now that a person would, start in a junior position and work all the way up through an organization and stay with it. That is, I think, the exception, and that's wonderful when that happens. But also you can think about it as, providing the picture of the pathway. If there's not necessarily the position in your organization, at least the person is sort of seeing where it can go in the future. I think there's this big disconnect between the way that we're educated in school and then what happens in the workforce. And so especially for people early in their careers, it's kind of tricky to figure out like, oh, okay, what's the next step here? How do I move forward? So career pathways is a huge one. Mentorship, which we touched on earlier, is another one. And that also gets into the sort of social infrastructure piece. But so how can you pair people who are, later on in their career, who are achieving mastery, with other people who have achieved mastery in other areas, with, board members, for example, with volunteers, and sort of creating those pieces. Are there ways that you can be involved with, schools locally and mentoring students in schools or bringing them into your space and creating that environment where people can grow professionally. Those are major ones that come to mind. We already talked about workload and those things earlier.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Talking about how it's not very often anymore for someone to stay within a company from junior to senior, that usually there's more jumping around, right? That's usually called churn, where people are leaving and coming in. And I was wondering, is there a motivation to reduce churn? That is, to inspire people to stay with your organization longer? Or is it okay to at some point saying, like, we've taught you everything that we can teach you, or you've given us everything you can give us, better that you move on to find some not greener pastures, but more different challenges or more aligned with where you're trying to go next? Like, is there a balance between trying to keep someone as long as possible because you want to invest in them and we'd love to see them with your organization for a long period of time? Or is there a balance to say, let's see whether we can work well together today, but it's okay that it's not going to be for a long time, and we'll just manage around that changing of the guard?
Yeah. Thoughts there. I mean, the first one is that organizational knowledge and understanding is something that's invaluable. And I mean, it's just so, like, people who work in organizations for a long time and they know the history of what's happened. They've been there for the things that happened that transition to what's happening today. You can't replace it, really. And also, when you have churn and you need to hire for a staff member, there's different statistics of how expensive that is. But basically, they range from 6 months to a year of the salary. And so if you have a lot of turnover, it's expensive, in that you lose productivity and you lose service and you lose things like that, as you're replacing people. The other piece of this, though, it has to do with funding and with programming and with what positions are funded and what aren't, because there may be a finite number of positions that are available in an organization. So you might have funding, for example, for 3 program managers and for 4 program coordinators and for 4 assistants, and you have to have someone leave in order for another person to promote up. So often it is that people get stuck in that. And it can help to have, in those situations, a compensation system that is continuing to motivate a person to stay, even if they're staying in, for example, the coordinator role when they want to move up to the manager role. So that some of those, that training, that mentorship, that can happen, and the employee can stay kind of as you're moving them into management one day. And then the other thing is, like, that's not all is the more advanced roles are not necessarily what people want to do. Like, people may want to go into a totally different line of work at some point in their career, or, they may go from wanting to work in nonprofits to wanting to work in a consulting firm, or wanting to work in the government, or wanting to work at a for-profit organization. And so, part of it is just understanding of your employee pool, who is likely to be one who will move up, and who are the ones who are more likely to want other kinds of opportunities. And listening to what people are saying and what they're wanting is such an important part of that, and sort of the planning for the future piece of churn.
I think there's something to be said too for new blood, new perspectives on things. Like, if you have the same people from day one as you do on day 1,000 or million, or I don't know, whatever number that makes sense, you don't always have new ideas, especially younger, fresh ideas. So I imagine there's a balance between keeping those longer people for the institutional knowledge, but then also having some new firecrackers coming in to say, what about this and all this new tech and all this new perspective and the young generation. So I imagine there's also a balance to be played there too.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I think that is such an important piece of the workforce, is making sure that you have new ideas coming in. And it may not even be a younger generation. It might be someone who has a certain set of skills that's transferable to the work that they would do at your organization, but they would bring a different perspective to it than someone who has been doing it for 10 years.
I'm curious then, from your perspective, do you know why we don't talk more about mental health? I'm taking kind of a step backward here, because we've talked a bit about it. There's a lot of good topics. I know we can go on for a long period of time, but for some reason, like you said, the even articles that come published on the same day, other articles get more attention than mental health. Like, it is such an important part. We are human. We can break. We've seen people break. Do you know why it's not being discussed more? And do you think there's a way that we can, besides having podcasts like this, increase the frequency of these kinds of conversations to make it more prevalent and have better understanding of what it is and how to prevent it?
I think there's a long history there that has to do with the connection between work and productivity, and this sort of feeling that if I'm paying someone to do work, then I own them and that they are my worker and they should be productive for the time that I'm paying them for. And that their time outside of work is where they can have things like their social interactions and, the other care work that they need to do and all of that. And that, for example, 100% of my time should be billable to, my grants when I'm working. And then if I need to do other things to organize myself or I need to be in meetings, then that shouldn't necessarily be paid because that's just the background things that you need to do in order to actually get the job done. I think that's the legacy of the attitude of, of work. It was designed kind of to be that. Well, I mean, we inherited it from when the Industrial Revolution happened. And I mean, there's ties between the way that factories were designed and the way that plantations were designed in the South and the slavery system. And so, there was in factories the payment of people for labor, but there were very long working hours and the pay was very low and, living conditions were very poor because people couldn't afford to support themselves. Through the 30s, we had these laws that were implemented around implementing a minimum wage. Minimum wage was meant at that time to be a living wage, like an amount that someone needed to earn in order to be able to, to pay for their house, pay for their food, pay for their medical expenses, put their, buy the clothes that they need, all those things. And now we have this great divergence actually between what the minimum wage is and what the living wage is. Currently, right now where I live, the minimum wage is $16 an hour, but the living wage is actually $37 an hour. It's one of the most expensive counties in the United States to live in. And so there's on the worker's side, like, if I'm being paid this money, it's so integrated into how we think about work. If I'm being paid this money, I have to be productive. And I want to prove to my employer that I'm good at my job and that I can do this. And, whatever they need, I want to be able to get it to them. And I want to be able to say yes. I don't, or I feel like I can't say no. And so I think that is part of why we don't have more discussions around mental health, because it's hard to say no to your boss. It's hard to say no to the team. It's hard to draw a boundary, even if it's a boundary around your health and what you're able to do and what you have the time to do. So I think creating environments in the workplace where people, have the ability to say, how long they need to do a thing, or, instead of saying, I need this by Friday, it's, we need this thing because we're moving forward this project. When do you think you can get it to us? And give a little bit of agency to people. And that can help a lot with workload. And then there are emergencies that happen, and and you really want to save the stress load for a true emergency that's happening. If it's a part of the normal workload of the organization, it shouldn't feel like an emergency all the time. It should feel like it is well balanced. And we go through times where it is stressful and hard, but we're able to come back to that equilibrium.
When you were talking, it reminded me of my younger days when I was a software developer. At the time, I felt I was not working unless I was in front of my computer. That any time spent away from the computer was not really work. So I think you're right. It's definitely ingrained in us from an earlier age. And I love the history of it because that makes total sense to me that it comes from all this background stuff. So thank you for sharing that. Any thoughts for the future? Any ways that we can, besides having more conversations about it, like if you had a magic wand or a superpower to be able to make some changes in the mental space, what would you do? What would you like to see happen?
Oh my gosh, if I could wave a magic wand, I would give everybody a 4-day work week.
That's a great start.
There's so many studies that actually show how beneficial that is for people. And I think, beyond that, or maybe as a precursor to that, just starting to have more conversations like this, especially with other executive directors or other people who are leading companies that are supporting nonprofits, and amongst, yourselves when you get together, asking how you're doing, how the other person's doing, how the team is doing, and being able to just kind of genuinely connect around things that are not just project oriented or just work oriented.
Awesome. Candice, this has been great. A lot of information here. You mentioned a couple of tools as well. So I wanted to know if you can share your contact information with people so that they can get in touch with you and maybe ask you more questions or learn more about these tools.
Yeah. Yeah. So the website is fortressandflourish.com. I'm sure we'll link it. And there's a contact me page on the website. So if you want that employee survey, let me know and I'd be happy to send it over to you, the template of it. And then I'm on Instagram. The Instagram is backpockethr. I think it's back.pocket.hr. And that is just my sort of entry level ad hoc HR support program. And so you can learn more about that there and also my podcast, The Hearth.
Awesome. Candice, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right, that's it for today. I'm Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me again in the next Agents of Nonprofit.